The CH-47 Chinook helicopter bucked violently as another RPG exploded 50 meters to starboard, showering the aircraft with debris and the acrid smell of cordite. Staff Sergeant Maya Chen gripped the crew chief's harness with white knuckles, her headset crackling with desperate voices from the ground below. 23 Navy SEALs were pinned down in a compound that intelligence had promised would be lightly defended. Intelligence, as usual, had been catastrophically wrong. Wildcard 7, this is Hammer 6. We need immediate extraction. We've got wounded and we're running low on ammunition. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the SEAL team leader whose confidence had evaporated somewhere between the third mortar round and the realization that they were surrounded by at least 60 Taliban fighters. Maya pressed her mic button, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Hammer 6, this is Wildcard 7. We're taking heavy fire, but we're not leaving without you. Give me your grid and condition of wounded. Grid 41R QM12345678890. We've got 4 urgent surgical, 2 walking wounded, and the rest are combat effective but low on ammo. They've got us boxed in on 3 sides with heavy machine gun positions on the high ground. No way we can make it to a standard LZ. The co-pilot, Captain Torres, turned in his seat, his face grim beneath his helmet. Chen, this is suicide. We can't land in that kill box. The bird won't survive 30 seconds on the ground. Maya studied the tactical display on her tablet, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in disaster. She had been flying medical evacuations for 3 years, had pulled countless wounded soldiers from impossible situations, but this was different. This was a full SEAL team trapped in what the enemy had turned into a carefully orchestrated ambush. The Taliban had learned to use the Americans' own loyalty against them, trap the elite soldiers, and the rescue birds would come. It was a strategy that had claimed 6 helicopters and 32 aircrew members in the past 18 months. But Maya Chen hadn't survived 2 deployments to Afghanistan by accepting the impossible as inevitable. She was the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had built a grocery store empire from a single corner shop in San Francisco, who had taught her that there was always another way if you were willing to look hard enough and sacrifice everything to find it. Torres, what's our fuel status? She asked, already calculating distances and flight times in her head. 20 minutes of flight time, maybe 25 if we push the envelope. She keyed her mic again. Hammer 6, I need you to pop smoke and give me exact positions of enemy machine gun nests. We're coming in, but it's going to be unconventional. Wildcard 7, negative. Command has already designated this area too hot for extraction attempts. You are ordered to return to base and wait for artillery support. Maya looked at the tactical radio that connected her directly to the forward operating base, Colonel Harrison. She could follow orders, return to safety, and let 23 of America's finest soldiers die while waiting for fire support that might never come. Or she could do what she had always done, find a way to bring everyone home. She reached over and switched off the command frequency.
Chen, what the hell are you doing? Torres demanded, but his voice carried more admiration than anger. He had flown with Maya before, had seen her thread a damaged helicopter through mountain passes in zero visibility to reach wounded Marines. She wasn't reckless, she was impossibly precise. Something stupid, she replied, then switched to the SEAL team frequency. Hammer 6, this is Wildcard 7. I'm going to need your team to do something that goes against every instinct you have. When I give the signal, I want half your team to break cover and run toward the eastern wall of the compound. Make noise, draw fire, make them think you're trying to break out that way. Copy that, but Chen, they'll cut us down in the open. Not if I'm drawing their attention elsewhere. Trust me on this. Maya turned to her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Bobby Martinez, a veteran of 4 deployments whose calm demeanor had seen them through countless dangerous missions. Bobby, I'm going to need you to prep for a non-standard pickup. We're not going to have time for the SEALs to come to us. Martinez nodded grimly. What do you need? I need you to be ready to throw out every piece of non-essential equipment we have. Seats, medical supplies we can't use in flight, anything that's not bolted down. We're going to be overweight and underpowered, and every pound matters. The crew chief began securing loose items and preparing the cabin for what he knew would be the most dangerous pickup of his career. Maya had a reputation for bringing everyone home, but she also had a reputation for asking her crews to trust her when the plan sounded insane. The helicopter's engines strained as Maya pushed the aircraft to its maximum speed, racing toward the compound where tracer rounds lit up the night sky like deadly fireflies. She could see the muzzle flashes from the Taliban positions, could count at least 8 heavy machine guns positioned on rooftops and behind walls. It was a perfect killing field, designed to destroy any aircraft that attempted to land. Wildcard 7, this is Base Commander. You are ordered to abort extraction attempt and return to base immediately. Maya heard Colonel Harrison's voice on the emergency frequency, but didn't respond. She was beyond orders now, operating in that space where training met instinct and where the only measure of success was whether her people came home alive. Torres, I need you to listen carefully. When we reach the compound, I'm going to come in fast and low from the west. I want you to suppress those machine gun positions with everything we have. Don't worry about ammunition. We either use it or we lose it. The co-pilot nodded, his hands already moving to arm the helicopter's defensive systems. The Chinook wasn't a gunship, but it carried enough firepower to buy them the precious seconds they would need. As they approached the compound, Maya could see the layout clearly through her night vision goggles. The SEALs were trapped in a U-shaped building with high walls on 3 sides and open ground to the east, ground that was covered by at least 4 machine gun positions. A standard extraction would require the SEALs to reach a landing zone in the open, where they would be cut down before they reached the helicopter. But Maya wasn't planning a standard extraction. She keyed her mic to the SEAL frequency. Hammer 6, 60 seconds. Are your wounded ready to move? As ready as they can be. Chen, whatever you're planning, please tell me you've done this before. Maya almost smiled despite the circumstances. First time for everything, Commander. Just be ready when I call.
The compound rushed toward them, muzzle flashes erupting from multiple positions as the Taliban fighters opened fire on the approaching helicopter. Tracer rounds streaked past the aircraft, and Maya felt the familiar calm that came over her in combat, the clarity that reduced the chaos to a series of calculations and adjustments. She pulled the helicopter into a steep climb, then rolled it inverted and dove toward the compound, using the building itself as cover from the eastern machine gun positions. Torres opened fire with everything they had, his rounds walking across the rooftops and forcing the enemy gunners to take cover. Now, Hammer 6, eastern wall, make noise. Below them, Maya could see the SEALs breaking cover, half the team running toward the eastern wall as planned, drawing fire and attention. The Taliban fighters responded exactly as she had hoped, concentrating their fire on the visible threat. But instead of setting down in the killing field, Maya did something no helicopter pilot had ever attempted in combat. She brought the Chinook down into the compound itself, threading the massive aircraft between the walls of the U-shaped building, using the structure to shield them from the heaviest enemy fire. The helicopter's rotors cleared the walls by inches, the downwash creating a hurricane of dust and debris that provided additional concealment. Maya felt the aircraft's skids touch down on the courtyard's uneven surface and immediately began calculating how much time they had before the enemy adjusted their positions to target the helicopter. "Go, go, go!" Martinez shouted over the intercom, but the SEALs were already moving. The wounded came first, carried by their teammates with the desperate efficiency of elite soldiers who had done this too many times. Maya held the helicopter steady as enemy fire began to find them, rounds sparking off the aircraft's armored hull and spider-webbing the windscreen. "Chen, we've got engine warning lights," Torres called out, his voice tight with concern. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Hydraulic pressure is dropping and we're getting over-temp warnings on the number 2 engine." Maya felt the aircraft shudder as another burst of machine gun fire found its mark. They were running out of time, and she could see that several SEALs were still making their way to the helicopter, including the decoy team that had drawn fire to the eastern wall. "Hammer 6, all personnel aboard?" "Negative, still have 8 men moving to your position." The helicopter lurched violently as an RPG exploded nearby, close enough that Maya could feel the heat through the aircraft's thin skin. Warning alarms filled the cockpit, competing with the chatter from the ground and the roar of enemy fire. This was the moment that would define everything. The choice between the possible and the impossible. Between the safe decision and the right one.
Maya looked at the fuel gauge, at the warning lights painting the instrument panel red, at the tactical display showing enemy positions closing on their location. She thought of her father, who had once told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. She thought of the 23 SEALs who were counting on her to do something that had never been done before. And then she made a choice that would change everything.
Medical evacuation crews will operate within established parameters, Colonel Harrison had said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many good soldiers die for bad decisions. We cannot risk losing helicopters and crews attempting extractions in unsurvivable conditions. Sometimes the best decision is the hardest one. Maya had nodded along with the rest of the aircrew, but inside she had been thinking about the photograph in her flight suit pocket. A picture of her parents standing in front of their first grocery store in San Francisco's Richmond district, their faces beaming with the pride of people who had built something from nothing. Her mother, Dr. Maya Chen, had fled Taiwan with nothing but a medical degree that American hospitals wouldn't recognize. Her father, David Chen, had worked 16-hour days in other people's restaurants before saving enough money to lease a tiny storefront that sold produce to the growing Asian community. They had taught Maya that there was always another way, always another solution if you were willing to work hard enough and think differently enough to find it. The military had given Maya structure, purpose, and the best flight training in the world. But it had also tried to teach her that some risks were unacceptable, that some missions were impossible, that some people were expendable in the service of the greater good. It was a lesson she had never quite learned. After the briefing, Maya had walked to the flight line where the Chinooks sat like giant metal insects in the Afghan sun. She ran her hand along the fuselage of her aircraft, checking for damage from their last mission, a routine transport that had become anything but routine when Taliban fighters had ambushed the convoy they were supporting. "Still talking to the bird, Chen?" Martinez had asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee that barely qualified as drinkable. "She talks back," Maya had replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Tells me things the instruments can't." Martinez was from East LA, the son of a mechanic who had taught him that machines had personalities if you knew how to listen to them. He had been Maya's crew chief for 8 months, long enough to trust her instincts even when they defied conventional wisdom. "What's she telling you today?" Maya had looked at the helicopter, noting the way the afternoon light caught the repairs to the main rotor housing, the patches where armor plating had been replaced after their encounter with small arms fire 3 weeks earlier. "She's tired of playing it safe." Torres had joined them, carrying his own cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had spent too much time thinking about mortality rates and insurance policies. "Chen, we need to talk about that last mission. Command is asking questions about our approach route." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest they think you took unnecessary risks getting to those Marines." Maya had felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest, the tension between doing what was safe and doing what was right. The Marines they had extracted had been surrounded by insurgents for 6 hours, taking casualties while waiting for support. By the time Maya's team had been cleared for the mission, conventional extraction routes would have required the wounded to move half a mile under fire to reach a safe landing zone. Instead, Maya had brought the helicopter down in a dried riverbed, using the terrain to mask their approach and landing close enough that the Marines could reach them without exposing themselves to enemy fire. It had worked. All 17 Marines had made it home alive. But it had also required flying below the safety minimums and accepting risks that made the command staff nervous. "Torres, how many Marines did we lose on that extraction?"
None, but
How many would we have lost if we had followed the standard approach? The co-pilot had been quiet for a moment, considering. He was a careful pilot, methodical and thorough. The kind of officer who read regulations for entertainment and believed in the chain of command. But he had also seen what happened when caution became paralysis, when following the rules meant watching good soldiers die. Probably 4 or 5, he had admitted. Maybe more if they had to move the wounded across that open ground. Then I'll take command's questions. That conversation had taken place 3 weeks before the mission that would change everything. Before Maya would have to choose between following orders and bringing everyone home. But even then, she had known that the choice was already made, that she would never be the kind of pilot who could accept acceptable losses. Her off-duty hours were spent differently than most of her fellow aircrew members. While they played video games or watched movies, Maya studied terrain maps, memorized emergency landing procedures, and practiced maneuvers that weren't in any official manual. She had converted a corner of her quarters into a study area where she analyzed every mission, looking for ways to do better, to be faster, to take fewer risks while achieving better outcomes. The walls were covered with photographs, not of family or friends, but of the soldiers she had evacuated. Marines with 1,000-yard stares and bandaged limbs. Army infantry soldiers who had lost friends but not hope. Air Force personnel who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but had made it home because Maya had been willing to fly into places other pilots wouldn't go. She wrote letters to some of them, brief notes that she never sent, explaining why she had chosen to become a helicopter pilot. The letters always started the same way. My parents taught me that every life has value, that every person deserves a chance to come home. They usually ended with an apology for not being better, for not being faster, for the few she hadn't been able to save. Maya's relationship with fear was complicated. She felt it every time she strapped into the pilot's seat, every time they lifted off for a mission that might be her last. But she had learned to use fear as a tool, to let it sharpen her focus and heighten her awareness without paralyzing her ability to act. Fear kept her alive. Courage got the job done. The nightmares came regularly. Dreams where she was too late, where the helicopter wouldn't start, where she made the wrong decision and watched good soldiers die because of her failures. She would wake up in a cold sweat, reaching for the notebook where she recorded every detail she could remember, looking for lessons that might save lives in the real world. Her commander's performance reviews were studies in contradiction. Staff Sergeant Chen is an exceptional pilot with outstanding technical skills and an impressive mission success rate, Colonel Harrison had written in her last evaluation. However, she demonstrates a concerning tendency to exceed authorized risk parameters and has difficulty accepting operational limitations. Recommend additional training on risk management and command structure. Maya had read the review without surprise. She knew that her approach to flying made the command staff uncomfortable, that they would prefer pilots who colored within the lines and accepted losses as an inevitable part of warfare. But she also knew that the soldiers on the ground didn't care about risk parameters when they were bleeding out in a foreign country, counting the minutes until someone came to bring them home. The other aircrew members had mixed opinions about Maya's methods. Some saw her as reckless, a pilot whose luck would eventually run out and take her crew with her. Others recognized her as someone who had found a way to thread the needle between courage and stupidity, who could make split-second decisions that saved lives without getting everyone killed in the process.
"Chen's crazy," Captain Sarah Williams had said during a conversation in the mess hall, "but she's the kind of crazy I want flying cover when everything goes to hell." Williams was right, and Maya knew it. She was operating in a space that existed between official doctrine and battlefield reality, where the difference between success and disaster could be measured in seconds and inches. It was a dangerous place to be, professionally and personally, but it was also where she felt most like herself, most like the daughter of immigrants who had built something meaningful from nothing but determination and hard work. The weight of command expectations pressed down on her constantly. Every mission briefing included reminders about acceptable risk levels, about the importance of bringing the crew home intact, about the cost of replacing aircraft and training personnel. Maya understood the mathematics of warfare, the brutal calculus that balanced lives saved against resources expended. But she also understood something that the command staff sometimes forgot, that the soldiers they were sent to rescue weren't statistics or acceptable losses, but sons and daughters, husbands and wives, people with families and dreams and futures that hung in the balance every time she lifted off from the airfield. The internal tension between duty and conscience had been building for months. She could feel it in the way she moved through her daily routines, in the way she interacted with her crew, in the careful distance she maintained from other pilots who might be asked to judge her decisions someday. She had started keeping a journal, pages filled with thoughts she couldn't share with anyone else. "How do you measure the value of a life?" she had written after a particularly difficult mission. Command has formulas, algorithms, cost-benefit analyses. But when you're looking at a 19-year-old kid from Iowa bleeding out in the middle of nowhere, the math doesn't seem to work anymore. The entries became more personal as the deployment progressed, revealing a pilot struggling with the weight of impossible decisions. "Brought home 8 soldiers today. Lost 1 on the way back. Couldn't get him to the surgical unit in time. Keep thinking there must have been something else I could have done, some way to fly faster or better. The family will get a flag and a letter about their son dying a hero. They won't know about the 30 seconds that might have made the difference." Maya's relationship with her crew had evolved into something deeper than professional respect. Martinez and Torres had learned to trust her instincts even when they didn't understand her logic, had come to recognize that she saw patterns and possibilities that others missed. They had also learned that she would never ask them to take a risk she wasn't willing to take herself. "You know she's going to get us all killed someday," Torres had confided to Martinez during a maintenance check. "Maybe," Martinez had replied, watching Maya inspect the aircraft with the intensity of someone who understood that small details could mean the difference between life and death. "But until then, she's going to save a lot of lives. Sometimes that's enough." The photographs in Maya's quarters told the story of a deployment measured in missions that shouldn't have succeeded, but did. There was the convoy ambush, where she had landed under fire to extract 12 wounded soldiers. The mountain rescue, where she had flown in zero visibility to reach a patrol that had been cut off by an avalanche. The night mission, where she had used her helicopter searchlight to guide a lost foot patrol through a minefield. Each photograph represented a moment when Maya had chosen to push beyond the boundaries of what was considered safe or reasonable, when she had decided that bringing everyone home was worth any personal or professional risk. The collection was growing, and Maya knew that someday it would include a mission that would force her to choose between her career and her conscience. She just hadn't expected that day to come so soon. The compound erupted into chaos as Maya held the Chinook steady in the impossible landing zone she had created. Enemy fire intensified as Taliban fighters repositioned to engage the helicopter, their rounds sparking off the aircraft's hull and sending vibrations through the airframe that she could feel in her bones. "8 men still moving to our position," Morrison's voice crackled through her headset, barely audible over the roar of gunfire and the helicopter's engine straining against the confined space. Maya watched her instruments as warning lights multiplied across the panel. Oil pressure was dropping in the number 2 engine, hydraulic systems were showing intermittent failures, and the fuel gauge was moving steadily toward empty. Every second they remained on the ground increased the probability that they would never leave it. "Torres, give me continuous suppressive fire on those rooftop positions. Don't let up for a second." The co-pilot nodded grimly, his hands moving across the weapons controls with practiced precision. The helicopter's defensive guns barked continuously, sending streams of tracer rounds toward the enemy positions and forcing the Taliban fighters to keep their heads down. Martinez was at the rear ramp, helping wounded SEALs into the aircraft while keeping count of personnel. 15 aboard, he shouted over the intercom. Still waiting on 8 plus the wounded from the eastern position.
Through her night vision goggles, Maya could see the remaining SEALs moving through the compound, carrying their wounded comrades and fighting a running battle with enemy forces that seemed to multiply with every passing minute. The decoy team that had drawn fire to the eastern wall was now fighting their way back to the helicopter, but they were taking casualties and running low on ammunition. An RPG streaked past the helicopter's nose, close enough that Maya could feel the heat wash over the cockpit. The explosion behind them sent debris raining down on the aircraft, and she heard Martinez curse as shrapnel peppered the cargo compartment. "Chen, we need to go now," Torres shouted, his voice tight with fear and urgency. "The bird can't take much more of this." Maya's mind raced through the possibilities, all of them bad. They could lift off with 15 SEALs aboard and leave 8 men to die in the compound. They could wait for the remaining men and risk losing everyone when the helicopter was finally destroyed by enemy fire. Or she could try something that had never been attempted in combat, something that would require her to push the aircraft beyond its design limits and trust her crew to do the impossible. "Martinez, I need you to lower the ramp and prepare for emergency pickup procedures. We're not leaving anyone behind." "Copy that. But Chen, we're already overweight and we haven't even got everyone aboard yet." "I know. Torres, how much ammunition do we have left for a suppressive fire?" 3 minutes, maybe less at this rate of expenditure." She keyed her mic to the SEAL frequency. "Hammer 6, I need those 8 men at the eastern wall to prepare for emergency extraction. They're gonna have to jump for it." "Say again, Wildcard 7? Jump for what?" "They're going to have to jump onto the helicopter. We can't land in that position, but I can get close enough for them to make it if they're willing to take the risk." There was silence on the frequency for several seconds, broken only by the sound of gunfire and explosions. Maya could imagine Morrison processing the implications of what she was suggesting. Asking his men to leap from a wall onto a moving helicopter in the middle of a firefight was beyond dangerous. It was nearly suicidal. "Chen, are you sure about this?" "I'm sure we're all dead if we don't try something different. Can your men make the jump?" "These are SEALs. They'll make it."
Maya began lifting the helicopter out of the courtyard, the overloaded aircraft responding sluggishly to her inputs. The number 2 engine was running hot, throwing warning lights across the instrument panel, but it was still producing power. She had to trust that it would hold together long enough to complete the extraction. As they cleared the compound walls, enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Machine gun rounds walked across the helicopter's fuselage, and Maya felt the aircraft shudder as hydraulic lines were severed and electrical systems took hits. The flight controls became heavier in her hands, requiring constant pressure to maintain altitude and heading. "Wildcard 7, this is Base Commander. You are ordered to abort extraction and return to base immediately. Repeat, abort extraction and return to base." Maya heard Colonel Harrison's voice on the emergency frequency, but was beyond caring about orders or consequences. 8 SEALs were waiting on that wall, and she was going to bring them home or die trying. She maneuvered the helicopter toward the eastern wall, where the remaining SEALs had taken position. Through her night vision, she could see them clearly. 8 men with gear and weapons, 2 of them wounded, all of them depending on her ability to do something that no pilot had ever done in combat. The wall was 15 feet high and surrounded by open ground that was swept by enemy fire. Maya couldn't land near it without exposing the helicopter to concentrated fire from multiple directions, but she could approach from the east, using the building to shield them from some of the enemy positions. "Hammer 6, 30 seconds. Are your men ready?" "As ready as they'll ever be. Chen, if this doesn't work, it'll work." Maya brought the helicopter in fast and low, the aircraft's downwash creating a hurricane of dust and debris that provided additional concealment. She could see the SEALs on the wall, silhouetted against the night sky, preparing to make a leap that would either save their lives or end them. The helicopter's rear ramp was lowered, creating a platform for the SEALs to land on. Maya had to time the approach perfectly. Too fast and the men would be blown off the ramp by the rotor wash. Too slow and enemy fire would destroy the aircraft before anyone could jump. 10 seconds, Martinez called out, his voice steady despite the impossible nature of what they were attempting. Maya brought the helicopter in alongside the wall, the aircraft's rotors clearing the structure by inches. The SEALs didn't hesitate. They jumped, one after another. 8 men launching themselves into space with the faith that their pilot would be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The first 4 made it cleanly onto the ramp, where Martinez and other SEALs grabbed them and pulled them into the aircraft. The 5th SEAL, one of the wounded, missed the ramp and would have fallen to his death if not for the quick action of his teammates who caught him and hauled him aboard. The 6th and 7th SEALs made successful jumps, but the 8th man, weighed down by extra ammunition and carrying a wounded comrade, was falling short. Maya saw him in her peripheral vision dropping toward the ground and made a split-second decision that defied every safety protocol she had ever learned. She dropped the helicopter's nose and slid the aircraft sideways, bringing the ramp directly beneath the falling SEAL. He hit the ramp hard, nearly bouncing off into the darkness, but Martinez was there to grab him and drag him into the aircraft. "All personnel aboard," Martinez shouted, his voice filled with disbelief and relief. Maya immediately began climbing, pulling the overloaded helicopter away from the compound as enemy fire erupted around them. The aircraft was struggling, engine straining against the excessive weight and battle damage, but it was flying. More importantly, all 23 SEALs were aboard.
But their ordeal was far from over.
Chen, we've got multiple warning lights and the number 2 engine is losing power, Torres reported, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored the failing systems. Maya could feel the helicopter's flight characteristics changing as damage accumulated and systems failed. The controls were becoming increasingly heavy, requiring constant corrections to maintain altitude and heading. The fuel gauge was approaching empty, and she was beginning to doubt whether they would make it back to base. "What's our distance to Bagram?" 43 miles, but we're losing altitude and airspeed. At this rate, we won't make it." Maya's mind raced through alternatives. There were several forward operating bases between their current position and Bagram, but most of them were small outposts with limited medical facilities. The wounded SEALs needed immediate surgical attention, and the closest trauma center was at their home base. "Martinez, how are the wounded?" 4 urgent surgical, 2 walking wounded. The urgent cases need to get to a trauma center within the next 20 minutes, or we're going to lose them." 20 minutes. Maya looked at her instruments and calculated their maximum possible speed with the damaged aircraft. They might make it to Bagram in 25 minutes if everything went perfectly. But nothing about this mission had gone perfectly so far. "Torres, what if we jettison everything non-essential? Seats, extra equipment, anything that isn't critical to flight operations. Might buy us a few minutes, but not enough. Chen, I think we need to consider diverting to FOB Lightning. It's only 15 minutes away." "Lightning doesn't have a trauma center. Those men will die if we take them there." Maya was facing another impossible choice, the kind that had defined her military career and would ultimately determine its end. She could play it safe, land at the nearest base, and watch 4 SEALs die from wounds that could have been treated if she had been willing to push the helicopter just a little further. Or she could attempt to reach Bagram, knowing that if the aircraft failed, everyone aboard would die. The decision was made easier by a voice from the cargo compartment. "Wildcard 7, this is Petty Officer Davis. I've got some medical training and I can keep these men alive for 30 minutes if you can get us to Bagram. Don't take us anywhere else." Davis was one of the SEALs Maya had just extracted, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio who had enlisted straight out of high school. He was covered in blood from treating his teammates, and he was telling her that he could buy them the time they needed if she was willing to take the risk. "Copy that, Davis. Bagram it is." Maya pushed the helicopter to its maximum possible speed, the aircraft vibrating violently as she exceeded safe operating limits. The number 2 engine was running so hot that she expected it to fail at any moment, but it continued to produce power, as if the machine understood that failure was not an option. The landscape rushed beneath them in the green glow of night vision. Rugged mountains giving way to valleys, then to the flat desert terrain that surrounded their base. Maya could see the lights of Bagram in the distance, but they seemed impossibly far away given the helicopter's deteriorating condition. Warning alarms filled the cockpit as multiple systems failed simultaneously. Hydraulic pressure dropped to critical levels, forcing Maya to use all her strength to control the aircraft. The fuel quantity indicator showed empty, though she knew there were still a few minutes of fuel remaining in the system. Chen, number 2 engine is failing, oil pressure is 0, and EGT is off the scale.
As if summoned by Torres' words, the number 2 engine seized with a grinding mechanical scream that Maya could hear even over her headset. The helicopter lurched violently as half its power disappeared, and she had to fight to maintain control as the aircraft began an uncontrolled descent. "Auto-rotation procedures," Maya shouted, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision as she prepared for an emergency landing that would be their last hope. But even as she began the emergency procedures that might save their lives, Maya was calculating distances and glide ratios, trying to determine if they could reach the base with a dead engine and an overloaded aircraft. The mathematics were brutal. They were still 12 miles from Bagram, and the helicopter's glide ratio with battle damage and excess weight would not carry them that far. They were going to crash in the Afghan desert, 23 SEALs and 4 aircrew members, all because Maya had refused to accept that some missions were impossible. As the ground rushed up to meet them, she keyed her mic one final time. "Bagram Tower, this is Wildcard 7 declaring emergency. We're going down 12 miles southeast of base with 27 souls on board. Request immediate search and rescue." The helicopter hit the ground hard, the landing gear collapsing and the fuselage sliding across the rocky terrain in a shower of sparks and debris. Maya felt her world turn upside down as the aircraft rolled, her harness cutting into her shoulders as gravity and momentum fought for control of her body. When the motion finally stopped, she was hanging upside down in her seat, fuel and hydraulic fluid dripping around her, the acrid smell of smoke filling her nostrils. But she was alive, and she could hear voices in the cargo compartment. Wounded voices, but voices nonetheless. "Sound off," Martinez's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. "Everyone report status." As the responses came back, Maya realized something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Not one of the 27 people aboard the helicopter had been killed in the crash. Her impossible mission had succeeded, but the cost was yet to be determined. She could hear helicopters approaching in the distance, search and rescue birds responding to her emergency call. In a few minutes, medical personnel would arrive to treat the wounded, and investigators would begin asking questions about why she had exceeded her authority and risked so many lives for a mission that command had declared impossible. Maya unbuckled her harness and dropped to the ceiling of the inverted aircraft, her head spinning from the impact and the realization of what she had done. She had saved 23 SEALs, but she had also destroyed a multi-million-dollar helicopter and violated direct orders from her commanding officer. As she helped Martinez and Torres evacuate the wounded SEALs from the wreckage, Maya knew that this was the end of her military career. She had made the choice between duty and conscience, between following orders and bringing everyone home. She had chosen to bring everyone home, and now she would face the consequences. The desert wind whistled through the wreckage as Maya helped carry the wounded toward the approaching rescue helicopters, their rotor wash creating dust devils that danced across the crash site like ghosts. Behind her, the twisted remains of her Chinook lay scattered across the rocky terrain, a testament to what happened when physics met determination, and determination won by the narrowest of margins. Lieutenant Commander Morrison approached her as the medical teams took over care of his wounded men. His face was streaked with blood and dirt, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Chen, what you did back there, I've never seen anything like it." Maya looked at the SEALs being loaded onto stretchers, at the young faces that would be going home to families who would never know how close they had come to losing them. Just doing my job, sir, Maya said. No, Morrison said firmly. What you did was way beyond anyone's job description. You saved 23 lives tonight, and I want you to know that we won't forget it.
But even as he spoke, Maya could see the investigation team arriving. Officers with clipboards and cameras who would spend the next several days determining exactly how much trouble she was in. The military didn't celebrate insubordination, even when it saved lives, especially when it destroyed expensive equipment in the process. Colonel Harrison's helicopter touched down 50 meters away, and Maya watched her commanding officer stride across the desert with the purposeful gait of someone who is about to end a career. She had known this moment would come eventually. She had been walking the line between duty and conscience for too long to avoid consequences forever. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Harrison said as he approached, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he had been thinking about this conversation for a long time. "We need to talk." "Yes, sir?" "You disobeyed direct orders tonight. You exceeded your authority, destroyed a aircraft worth $60 million, and endangered the lives of your crew and the personnel you were sent to extract." Maya stood at attention, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Harrison's shoulder. "Yes, sir." "You also saved 23 American servicemen who would otherwise be dead right now. That complicates things considerably." Harrison was a career officer who had risen through the ranks by following orders and making sound decisions based on calculated risks. He understood the chain of command, the importance of discipline, and the necessity of accepting losses in pursuit of larger objectives. But he was also a soldier who had seen too many good men die, and he understood the weight of command decisions that traded lives for operational objectives. "Chen, in 30 years of military service, I have never seen a more flagrant violation of operational authority combined with a more successful mission outcome. Frankly, I don't know whether to court-martial you or recommend you for a medal." "Sir, I understood the risks and accepted responsibility for the consequences when I made the decision to proceed with the extraction." "Did you? Did you really understand that your actions tonight will be reviewed by every level of command from here to the Pentagon? That there will be investigations, hearings, and reports that will determine not just your future, but the future of every medical evacuation pilot in this theater?" Maya had not considered the broader implications of her actions, had not thought about how her decision would affect other pilots or future missions. She had been focused entirely on the immediate problem, 23 SEALs who needed to come home. The larger consequences had not entered her calculations. "Sir, I did what I thought was right." "I know you did. That's what makes this so complicated." The investigation began immediately, even as the wounded SEALs were being transported to medical facilities. Investigators photographed the crash site, interviewed crew members, and began the painstaking process of reconstructing the sequence of events that had led to the destruction of a Chinook helicopter and the successful extraction of an entire SEAL team. Captain Torres and Staff Sergeant Martinez were questioned separately, asked to provide detailed accounts of Maya's actions and decisions throughout the mission. Both men were careful to emphasize that they had supported her decisions and had never felt that she was being reckless or endangering the crew unnecessarily. "Chen knows helicopters better than anyone I've ever flown with," Torres told the investigators. "When she says something can be done, it can be done. I've never seen her make a decision that wasn't based on sound judgment and complete understanding of the aircraft's capabilities." Martinez was even more direct in his support. "Staff Sergeant Chen saved 23 lives tonight. If that's not what we're supposed to do, then somebody needs to explain to me what our mission actually is." But the investigators were not interested in mission success rates or lives saved. They were focused on regulations violated, procedures ignored, and orders disobeyed. The military ran on discipline and adherence to established protocols, and Maya had violated both in spectacular fashion. The formal hearing was scheduled for 1 week after the incident, giving investigators time to complete their reports and giving Maya time to prepare her defense. She was assigned a military lawyer, Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had previously defended pilots in similar cases. "Chen, I'm going to be honest with you," Walsh said during their first meeting. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. You disobeyed direct orders, exceeded operational authority, and destroyed government property. The fact that you saved lives doesn't change those facts. What are my options? You can plead guilty to the charges and hope for leniency based on the mission outcome. You can fight the charges and argue that you were justified in your actions. Or you can accept non-judicial punishment and resign from the service." Maya had spent the week since the crash thinking about her future, about what she wanted to do with the rest of her life if her military career was over. She had also spent time with the photographs in her quarters, looking at the faces of soldiers she had brought home over 3 years of combat deployments. "Captain Walsh, what happens if I fight the charges and lose?" "Court-martial, possible imprisonment, dishonorable discharge. Your military career would be over and your civilian prospects would be severely limited." "And if I plead guilty?" "Probably administrative discharge, possible reduction in rank, forfeiture of some pay and benefits. You'd be able to transition to civilian life without a criminal record." Maya looked at the lawyer across the small table in the JAG office. This woman who had spent her career defending soldiers who had made difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. "What would you do?" Walsh was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "Officially, I would recommend that you accept responsibility for your actions and seek the most favorable disposition possible. Unofficially, Chen, what you did was extraordinary. Sometimes the military needs to be reminded that our job is to bring people home, not to follow procedures." The hearing room was packed with personnel from across the base, pilots, crew chiefs, commanders, and enlisted soldiers who had heard about the extraction and wanted to see how the military would handle a case that challenged the fundamental tension between orders and conscience. Maya sat at the defendant's table in her dress uniform, the ribbons on her chest representing 3 years of distinguished service and multiple commendations for heroism. Across the room, the prosecution team prepared to argue that heroism could not excuse insubordination, that the military could not function if soldiers were allowed to ignore orders whenever they disagreed with command decisions. Lieutenant Colonel James Reed, the prosecutor, opened his case with a straightforward presentation of the facts. Staff Sergeant Chen received direct orders to abort her extraction mission and return to base. She acknowledged those orders, then deliberately ignored them. She exceeded her operational authority, endangered her crew, and destroyed aircraft worth $60 million. These are facts, not opinions, and they cannot be disputed regardless of the mission outcome. Captain Walsh's defense focused on the extraordinary circumstances of the mission and Maya's track record of successful operations under difficult conditions. Staff Sergeant Chen was faced with an impossible choice: follow orders and watch 23 American servicemen die, or exceed her authority and bring them home. She chose to bring them home, and every one of those SEALs is alive today because of her decision. Walsh argued that Maya's actions were consistent with the military's core mission and values, that her decision to proceed with the extraction was based on sound judgment and superior knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities. She presented testimony from Morrison and his SEALs, who unanimously supported Maya's actions and credited her with saving their lives. The prosecution wants you to believe that following orders is more important than saving lives. But Staff Sergeant Chen understood something that her commanders did not: that the mission was possible, that the risks were acceptable, and that 23 American soldiers deserved a chance to come home to their families. The testimony phase of the hearing revealed the complex emotions and conflicting loyalties that Maya's actions had created throughout the command structure. Several pilots testified that they admired her skill and courage, but were concerned about the precedent her actions might set. Commanders expressed frustration with her insubordination while acknowledging the successful mission outcome. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran crew chief with 20 years of experience, captured the dilemma perfectly in his testimony. Chen is the best pilot I've ever flown with, and what she did that night was incredible. But I've got a 19-year-old crew chief who thinks that if Chen can ignore orders, maybe he can too. How do I explain to him that some rules can be broken and others can't? The hearing lasted 3 days, with witnesses testifying about Maya's character, her previous missions, and the specific circumstances of the SEAL extraction. The panel of officers who would determine her fate listened carefully to all the testimony, but their questions focused primarily on the precedent her actions might set and the impact on military discipline. On the final day, Maya was given the opportunity to make a statement on her own behalf. She stood before the panel in her dress uniform, looking at the faces of officers who would determine whether her military career continued or ended. I joined the military to serve my country and to bring American soldiers home safely. For 3 years, I have done that job to the best of my ability, following orders and accepting the guidance of my commanders. But on the night in question, I was faced with a choice between following orders and fulfilling my mission. I chose my mission. Maya's voice was steady as she continued. I do not regret my decision. 23 American servicemen are alive today because I was willing to exceed my authority and take risks that my commanders considered unacceptable. If that makes me unfit for military service, then I accept that judgment, but I will not apologize for bringing everyone home. The panel deliberated for 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Colonel Harrison, serving as the presiding officer, read the findings with a neutral expression that revealed nothing about his personal feelings regarding the case. The panel finds that Staff Sergeant Chen did willfully disobey lawful orders, did exceed her operational authority, and did endanger her crew and aircraft. However, the panel also finds that her actions were motivated by a desire to save American lives and were consistent with her understanding of her mission responsibilities. Maya felt her heart racing as Harrison continued. Given the extraordinary circumstances of this case and Staff Sergeant Chen's exemplary service record, the panel recommends administrative separation with an honorable discharge and reduction in rank to sergeant. The panel further recommends that Staff Sergeant Chen be considered for the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the extraction mission. The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations as the implications of the verdict became clear. Maya would be leaving the military, but with her honor intact and recognition for her heroism. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but acknowledged the complex realities of her situation. As the hearing concluded and personnel began filing out of the room, Morrison approached Maya with several of his SEALs. Chen, I want you to know that every man on my team owes his life to you. If there's ever anything we can do for you, anything at all, you just have to ask.
Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the Institute's director, watched from the back of the room as Maya led the group through a complex scenario simulation. The exercise required teams to coordinate multiple agencies in response to a fictional earthquake that had trapped workers in a collapsed building. Traditional rescue protocols were insufficient due to the scale of the disaster and the instability of the structure. "What resources do you have available?" Maya asked as the team struggled with the scenario parameters. "Standard search and rescue equipment, but the building is too unstable for conventional approaches," replied Captain Sarah Kim, a fire department rescue specialist from Los Angeles. "Then don't use conventional approaches. What else is possible?" Maya had learned that the key to breakthrough thinking was helping people move beyond their initial assumptions about what was possible or impossible. Most emergency responders were highly trained and experienced, but their expertise could sometimes become a limitation when faced with situations that fell outside established parameters. The earthquake scenario was based on a real incident that had occurred in Turkey 3 months earlier. Maya had been part of an international consulting team that had advised on the rescue operations, working with local authorities to develop innovative approaches to reaching survivors trapped in unstable structures. The Turkish experience had reinforced lessons Maya had learned during her military service, that expertise and experience were valuable but insufficient when facing unprecedented challenges.
The responders who had been most effective were those who could combine their technical skills with creative problem-solving and the courage to attempt solutions that had never been tried before. The Turkish rescue teams saved 17 people who would have died if we had relied on standard procedures, Maya told the training group. They did it by recognizing that the situation required new approaches and being willing to accept calculated risks to achieve better outcomes. One of the participants, a Navy helicopter pilot named Lieutenant Jessica Torres, no relation to Maya's former co-pilot, raised her hand. How do you know when the risk is justified? How do you distinguish between calculated risk and recklessness? It was the question Maya heard most frequently, the one that went to the heart of the dilemma she had faced in Afghanistan. The military had invested considerable resources in analyzing her decision-making process, trying to develop criteria that could guide future pilots facing similar situations. Risk assessment isn't just about probability and consequences, it's also about alternatives. In my case, the alternative to attempting the extraction was certain death for 23 people. That changed the risk calculation fundamentally. Maya had spent months working with military psychologists and decision-making experts to develop what had become known as the Chen framework, a structured approach to crisis decision-making that emphasized outcome analysis alongside traditional risk assessment. The framework had been adopted by emergency response agencies across the country and was being studied by organizations worldwide. The framework consisted of 4 key components: situation analysis, outcome assessment, resource evaluation, and consequence acceptance. Each component required responders to move beyond conventional thinking and consider possibilities that might not be covered by existing procedures. Situation analysis means understanding not just what's happening, but why existing procedures aren't sufficient. Outcome assessment requires you to clearly define what success looks like and what failure costs. Resource evaluation means identifying all available capabilities, not just the ones you normally use. And consequence acceptance means taking personal responsibility for the results of your decisions. Lieutenant Torres nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you're asking us to think like entrepreneurs or innovators, not just emergency responders. Exactly. Innovation under pressure requires the same kind of thinking that drives breakthrough solutions in any field. The willingness to challenge assumptions, combine resources in new ways, and accept responsibility for unprecedented decisions.
The ceremony continued with remarks from officials and representatives, but Maya's attention was focused on a conversation she had with Martinez the previous week. He had called to tell her about changes being implemented in medical evacuation procedures, modifications to training programs that emphasized creative problem-solving, and expanded authority for aircraft commanders in emergency situations. Chen, they're calling it the Chen Protocol, Martinez had said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and irony. Command is trying to figure out how to train pilots to think like you without encouraging them to ignore orders like you did. The protocol represented an acknowledgement that Maya's success had revealed gaps in existing procedures, that there were situations where rigid adherence to established doctrine could cost lives unnecessarily. Training programs were being modified to include scenarios that required pilots to make complex decisions under pressure, to balance risk against reward in ways that existing procedures did not address. But the protocol also highlighted the fundamental tension between individual initiative and military discipline. How could the military encourage the kind of creative thinking that had saved 23 SEALs while maintaining the chain of command that was essential to effective operations? Maya's case had forced conversations that had no easy answers. After the ceremony, Maya found herself surrounded by reporters who wanted to understand the woman behind the story that had captivated military and civilian audiences alike. They asked about her motivations, her decision-making process, and her feelings about being forced to leave the military she had served with distinction. "Sergeant Chen, do you regret your decision to disobey orders?"
Maya considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would be quoted and analyzed by people trying to understand the implications of her actions. I regret that the situation required me to choose between following orders and saving lives. I don't regret choosing to save lives. What message do you want to send to other military personnel who might face similar situations? I want them to remember that our job is to bring people home. Everything else is secondary to that mission. The reporters continued asking questions, but Maya was distracted by a conversation happening near the back of the auditorium. A young Air Force lieutenant was talking to her parents, asking them about their daughter's childhood and the experiences that had shaped her character. Maya was always like this, Li Chen was saying in her accented English. When she was little, she would bring home stray animals, children who were being bullied, anyone who needed help. We used to joke that she had no sense of what was possible and what was impossible. David Chen nodded in agreement. She got that from her mother. Li came to America with nothing but determination and a belief that any problem could be solved if you worked hard enough to find the solution. Maya learned early that there is always another way. The lieutenant was taking notes, clearly working on a story about the personal background that had produced someone capable of making the decisions Maya had made. But Maya knew that the reporters would never fully understand the complexity of the choice she had faced, the weight of responsibility that came with holding other people's lives in your hands. As the ceremony concluded and people began filing out of the auditorium, Morrison approached Maya with a serious expression. "Chen, I need to tell you something that hasn't been made public yet." "What is it?" "The intelligence that said the compound would be lightly defended, it was wrong, but not because of poor analysis. Someone fed us bad information deliberately. We were set up, walked into an ambush that was designed to kill my entire team and anyone who tried to rescue us." Maya felt a chill run through her as the implications became clear. The mission had not been a routine extraction that had gone wrong. It had been a trap, carefully planned and executed by someone with access to American intelligence and operational planning.
Who knows about this? Very few people. The investigation is ongoing, but preliminary evidence suggests we have a serious security breach somewhere in the intelligence community. What you did that night didn't just save 23 SEALs. You prevented a major intelligence victory for the Taliban. The revelation cast Maya's actions in an entirely different light. She had not simply exceeded her authority to attempt a difficult rescue. She had unknowingly prevented an enemy operation that could have compromised future missions and cost many more American lives. "Morrison, why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know the whole truth about what happened that night. And because there are people in the intelligence community who want to talk to you about what you observed during the mission." Maya spent the next several hours in debriefings with intelligence analysts who were trying to piece together the security breach that had nearly cost Morrison's team their lives. She provided detailed accounts of enemy positions, equipment, and tactics that had been employed during the ambush, information that helped analysts understand how the Taliban had prepared for the mission. The intelligence revelations also explained some of the confusion and conflict surrounding Maya's case. Several officials who had criticized her decision to proceed with the extraction had been unaware that the mission was based on compromised intelligence. Her success had prevented them from learning that their planning had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. But the most significant revelation came from Dr. Sarah Thompson, a psychologist who had been studying decision-making under extreme stress for the Department of Defense. Thompson had analyzed hundreds of combat situations, looking for patterns that could improve training and preparation for difficult scenarios. "Sergeant Chen, what you did that night represents a perfect example of what we call positive deviance, the ability to achieve exceptional results by departing from established norms and procedures. Your decision-making process bypassed traditional risk assessment in favor of outcome-focused analysis." Thompson explained that Maya's success had been based on her ability to process multiple variables simultaneously: aircraft capabilities, enemy positions, personnel requirements, environmental factors, and synthesized them into a solution that existing doctrine could not accommodate. Most pilots in your situation would have focused on the risks and concluded that the mission was impossible. You focused on the requirements and found a way to make it possible. That's a fundamentally different approach to problem solving. The psychological analysis helped explain why Maya's actions had been so controversial within the military establishment. She had not simply broken rules, she had demonstrated an alternative approach to command decision-making that challenged existing assumptions about risk, authority, and responsibility. 3 months after the ceremony, Maya received a phone call that would change her life again. The caller was Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the director of a new research institute focused on crisis management and emergency response. The institute was funded by a combination of government agencies and private foundations, tasked with developing improved methods for handling complex emergency situations. Ms. Chen, we're looking for people who have demonstrated exceptional decision-making ability under extreme pressure. Your case has been studied extensively, and we believe your insights could be invaluable in developing new approaches to crisis management. The position would involve working with emergency response teams, developing training programs, and consulting on situations that required creative problem-solving under pressure. It was an opportunity to continue serving others while applying the skills and experience she had gained in the military. But more importantly, it was a chance to ensure that other people facing impossible choices would have better tools and support than she had possessed during her own moment of crisis.
Maya accepted the position and found herself working with firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and other emergency responders who faced life-and-death decisions every day. Her military experience provided unique perspectives on leadership under pressure, but she was constantly learning from professionals who had spent their careers making split-second decisions with incomplete information. The Institute's work attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Corporate executives dealing with business crises sought training in decision-making under pressure. Disaster relief organizations wanted to improve their response capabilities. Even NASA reached out for consultation on mission planning for space exploration, where the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Maya's reputation grew beyond the military and emergency response communities. She was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and leadership forums, sharing insights about courage, decision-making, and the responsibility that comes with holding other people's lives in your hands. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Navy SEALs she had rescued had stayed in touch, following her transition to civilian life and her work with the Research Institute. Morrison, now promoted to commander, called her with news that would bring their story full circle. "Chen, I wanted you to be the first to know. The Navy is establishing a new training program for high-risk extraction operations. It's based on analysis of your mission and the techniques you use to make the impossible possible. The program would teach pilots to think beyond conventional parameters, to consider options that existing doctrine did not address, and to make complex decisions under pressure with confidence and precision." It was recognition that Maya's approach to the impossible mission had not been reckless improvisation, but sophisticated analysis executed under extreme conditions. "What are they calling the program?" Morrison's voice carried a note of satisfaction that suggested justice had finally been served. "The Chen method. They're going to teach every extraction pilot in the Navy to think like you." Maya felt a complex mixture of emotions as she absorbed the news. Her decision to exceed her authority and risk everything to save 23 SEALs had cost her military career, but had ultimately changed how the military approached impossible missions. Her methods would now be taught to future generations of pilots, ensuring that other soldiers in desperate situations would have advocates willing to push beyond the boundaries of what was considered possible. The recognition also carried responsibility. Maya knew that her techniques and decision-making process would be studied, analyzed, and applied in situations she could not anticipate. Future pilots would be trained to think creatively and act decisively, but they would also need to understand the weight of responsibility that came with exceeding established authority. As Maya hung up the phone, she thought about the chain of events that had begun with a desperate call for help in an Afghan compound. Her decision to bring everyone home had cost her military career, but had ultimately changed how the military approached impossible missions. Her methods would now be taught to future generations of pilots, ensuring that other soldiers in desperate situations would have advocates willing to push beyond the boundaries of what was considered possible. 2 years after leaving the military, Maya Chen stood before a group of emergency response personnel in a training facility outside Denver, Colorado. The audience included firefighters, paramedics, search and rescue specialists, and military personnel, all individuals who regularly face situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Crisis decision-making isn't about ignoring rules or procedures, Maya explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had tested theory against reality and survived to share the lessons. It's about understanding when those rules and procedures are insufficient for the situation you are facing and having the tools to find alternate solutions. The training program Maya had developed with the Crisis Management Institute had evolved far beyond her original military experience. She had studied decision-making under pressure across multiple disciplines, learning from experts in fields ranging from emergency medicine to disaster response to hostage negotiation. The program now incorporated insights from psychology, organizational behavior, and systems analysis.
Maya looked at the faces of the men she had risked everything to save. Young soldiers who would be going home to families and futures that had almost been cut short in an Afghan compound. "Just live good lives," she said. "Make it worth it." The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony took place 6 weeks after Maya's discharge from the military, in a small auditorium at Travis Air Force Base in California. The timing was deliberate. The military wanted to recognize her heroism while maintaining distance from the controversy surrounding her methods. Maya sat in the front row wearing a civilian business suit, no longer Sergeant Chen, but simply Maya Chen, former helicopter pilot. The auditorium was filled with an unusual mix of attendees. Current military personnel sat alongside veterans, defense contractors, and journalists who had followed the story of the extraction that had challenged military doctrine and forced difficult conversations about duty, orders, and moral courage. In the back row, Maya spotted her parents, who had flown in from San Francisco for the ceremony. David and Lee Chen looked out of place among the military personnel. 2 immigrants in their 60s who had spent their lives building grocery stores and raising children, never imagining that their daughter would become the center of a national debate about military leadership and individual conscience. They watched the proceedings with the quiet pride of people who had always believed their daughter would find a way to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. General Patricia Williams, the Air Force Chief of Staff, took the podium to present the award. Williams was a pioneering officer who had broken barriers throughout her career, the first woman to command a combat wing and the first to hold her current position. She understood the complex dynamics of Maya's case better than most of the officials who had judged it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to recognize extraordinary courage and skill displayed under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. On the night of March 15th, Sergeant Maya Chen faced an impossible choice: follow orders and watch 23 American servicemen die, or exceed her authority and risk everything to bring them home." Williams paused, her eyes finding Maya in the front row. Sergeant Chen chose to bring them home. Her decision to proceed with an extraction mission that had been deemed impossible by higher command resulted in the successful rescue of 23 Navy SEALs who otherwise had perished in enemy territory. The citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross was read aloud, detailing Maya's actions during the extraction and the extraordinary flying skills that had made the impossible mission successful. The words were formal and precise, but they could not capture the split-second decisions, the physical and mental demands, and the weight of responsibility that Maya had carried that night.
for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight under combat conditions. Sergeant Maya Chen displayed courage, skill, and determination that reflected great credit upon herself and the United States Air Force. Her willingness to risk her own life to save others exemplifies the highest traditions of military service. As Maya stood to receive the medal, she could see the faces of people whose lives had been changed by her decision. Morrison and 8 of his SEALs had been granted leave to attend the ceremony, along with Martinez and Torres, who had supported her throughout the investigation and hearing. Their presence meant more to her than any official recognition could. But Maya also noticed the absence of other faces. Colonel Harrison and other commanders who had been forced to balance their respect for her heroism against their concerns about military discipline. The military's relationship with Maya's actions remained complicated, acknowledging her success while maintaining that her methods could not be officially endorsed. General Williams pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to Maya's suit jacket, the medal's weight minimal compared to the responsibility it represented. Sergeant Chen, your actions on March 15th saved 23 lives and demonstrated the courage and skill that define our finest aviators. The American people owe you a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid.
Maya's work with the Institute had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Technology companies were studying her decision-making framework to improve their crisis response capabilities. Medical researchers were applying her principles to emergency treatment protocols. Even NASA had consulted with her on mission planning for Mars exploration, where the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances could determine mission success or failure. But the most meaningful validation of Maya's approach came from the people whose lives had been directly affected by her decisions. The 23 SEALs she had rescued had remained in contact, many of them now serving in leadership positions where they applied lessons learned from their own experience with impossible situations. Commander Morrison, now serving as an instructor at the Naval War College, had incorporated Maya's story into his curriculum on leadership under pressure. Chen taught us that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is play it safe, he told his students. When lives are on the line, following procedures that you know will fail isn't prudent, it's cowardice. Morrison had also been instrumental in establishing the Morrison-Chen Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided support for military families affected by combat operations. The foundation funded research into improved extraction techniques, supported families of wounded veterans, and advocated for changes in military policy that prioritized bringing everyone home. Maya served on the Foundation's board of directors, working alongside Morrison and other veterans to translate their combat experience into systemic improvements. The Foundation had already influenced changes in military medical evacuation procedures, training programs, and equipment procurement. Our mission is simple, Maya explained to a group of Foundation donors during a fundraising event in Washington, D.C. We want to ensure that no one is left behind because someone decided that a rescue was too difficult or too dangerous to attempt. The Foundation's work had produced measurable results. New helicopter designs incorporated features that improved performance in challenging environments. Training programs now included scenarios that required pilots to think beyond conventional parameters. Most importantly, command structures had been modified to give field commanders more authority to make real-time decisions based on changing circumstances. But Maya's greatest impact came through the individuals she trained and mentored. The Institute's programs had reached thousands of emergency responders, military personnel, and other professionals who faced life-and-death decisions in their work. Many of them had gone on to apply Maya's principles in their own crisis situations, saving lives and achieving outcomes that would not have been possible using conventional approaches.
Dr. Thompson, the Defense Department psychologist who had studied Maya's decision-making process, published a comprehensive analysis that became required reading at military academies and emergency response training centers. The study concluded that Maya's success had resulted from a unique combination of technical competence, psychological resilience, and moral clarity that enabled her to function effectively under extreme pressure. Sergeant Chen demonstrated that exceptional results are possible when individuals combine high levels of technical competence with the courage to challenge established limitations, Thompson wrote. Her decision-making process provides a model for developing improved approaches to crisis leadership across multiple disciplines. The analysis had broader implications for understanding how organizations could encourage innovation while maintaining necessary discipline and structure. Maya's case suggested that exceptional performance often required individuals to operate at the boundaries of established authority, making decisions that their superiors might not approve but that circumstances demanded. 3 years after leaving the military, Maya received an invitation that brought her story full circle. The Air Force Academy requested her participation in their annual leadership symposium, asking her to address cadets who would soon face their own decisions about duty, conscience, and moral courage.
Standing before 400 future officers in the Academy's auditorium, Maya looked out at young faces that reminded her of her own early years in military service. These cadets would soon be responsible for equipment worth millions of dollars, and more importantly, for the lives of the people under their command. You will face situations where following orders conflicts with your understanding of what's right, Maya told them. Those moments will define not just your career, but your character. I can't tell you what decisions to make, but I can tell you that you'll have to live with the consequences of whatever you choose. Maya shared the story of her extraction mission, but she also talked about the costs of her decision, the end of her military career, the stress on her crew, the difficult questions about military discipline and individual conscience. She wanted the cadets to understand that courage came with consequences, that doing the right thing wasn't always the same as doing the smart thing. I don't regret saving those 23 SEALs, she concluded, but I also don't pretend that my decision was simple or that the consequences were easy to accept. Leadership means making difficult choices with incomplete information and taking responsibility for the results. The question-and-answer session that followed revealed the complexity of issues that the next generation of military leaders would face. Cadets asked about the balance between innovation and discipline, about how to challenge authority constructively, and about the responsibility that came with having other people's lives in their hands. One cadet asked the question that Maya had been expecting. How do we know when we're ready to make the kind of decision you made? Maya considered her answer carefully, aware that these young officers would soon be facing their own impossible situations. You're never ready, but that doesn't mean you can't be prepared. Study your profession, understand your equipment, know your people. Most importantly, be clear about your values and what you're willing to sacrifice to uphold them. After the symposium, Maya was approached by Brigadier General Patricia Williams, who had since been promoted from her position as Chief of Staff. Williams had followed Maya's post-military career and had been instrumental in ensuring that her techniques were incorporated into Air Force training programs. "Chen, I have a proposition for you," Williams said as they walked across the Academy campus. "The Air Force is establishing a new position, Director of Innovation and Crisis Leadership. We want someone who understands both the importance of military discipline and the necessity of thinking beyond conventional parameters." Maya stopped walking and turned to face the general. "You're offering me a way back into the military?" "I'm offering you a chance to institutionalize the lessons you've learned,
to ensure that future pilots have better tools and support when they face impossible situations. You would work directly with training commands, equipment development teams, and operational planners to incorporate innovative thinking into our standard procedures. The offer represented a remarkable evolution in the military's relationship with Maya's story. 3 years earlier, she had been forced to choose between her career and her conscience. Now, the same institution was asking her to help reshape how it approached the tension between orders and outcomes. General, what makes you think the military is ready for this kind of change? Williams smiled, her expression suggesting that she had been anticipating the question. Because we've learned that the cost of not changing is higher than the cost of changing. Your methods have been tested in multiple situations over the past 3 years, and they work. More importantly, they work without compromising the discipline and structure that make our forces effective. Maya spent several weeks considering the offer, consulting with mentors, colleagues, and the veterans whose lives had been affected by her decisions. The opportunity to influence military policy and training from within the system was appealing, but she was also concerned about the potential for her message to be diluted or compromised by institutional pressures. Morrison provided the perspective that ultimately influenced her decision. Chen, you've proven that it's possible to challenge the system from the outside. Now you have a chance to improve the system from the inside. Those SEALs you saved, they're now training the next generation of operators. Your influence is already there. This just makes it official.
Maya accepted the position and found herself back in uniform, but with a mission that was fundamentally different from her previous military service. Instead of flying helicopters, she was reshaping how the military thought about leadership, innovation, and the responsibility to bring everyone home. Her first major project was developing a comprehensive training program that incorporated crisis decision-making into all aspects of military education. The program included case studies from multiple disciplines, simulation exercises that required unconventional solutions, and mentorship opportunities that paired experienced officers with junior personnel facing difficult decisions. "We're not trying to create insubordinate officers," Maya explained to a group of training commanders during a planning session. "We're trying to create officers who can think creatively within the bounds of their authority and who know when and how to challenge those bounds constructively." The program was piloted at 3 military academies and 6 training bases, with results that exceeded even Maya's optimistic expectations. Officers who completed the training demonstrated improved performance in complex scenarios, better decision-making under pressure, and increased confidence in their ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. But the most significant validation came from operational units that began applying the training principles in real-world situations. A Navy destroyer captain used Maya's framework to develop an innovative approach to maritime rescue operations that saved 17 sailors from a sinking vessel in rough seas. An Army unit commander applied crisis decision-making principles to extract civilians from a conflict zone using methods that conventional doctrine would not have supported. Each success story reinforced the value of Maya's approach, while also demonstrating that innovation and discipline could coexist effectively. The military was learning to encourage creative thinking without sacrificing the structure and hierarchy that made coordinated operations possible. Maya's work extended beyond training into equipment development and operational planning. She worked with engineers to design helicopters that could perform better in challenging environments, collaborated with intelligence analysts to improve mission planning processes, and consulted with commanders on operations that required unconventional approaches. The technical improvements were significant, but the cultural changes were even more important.
The military was developing a more nuanced understanding of leadership that valued both compliance and innovation, that recognized when following orders was appropriate and when challenging them was necessary. 5 years after her court-martial, Maya stood before the same panel of officers who had ended her first military career. This time, she was presenting the results of the Innovation and Crisis Leadership Program, demonstrating how her approach to impossible situations had been institutionalized without compromising military effectiveness. Colonel Harrison, now a general and serving as the program's oversight commander, listened as Maya presented data showing improved mission success rates, reduced casualties, and enhanced readiness across multiple commands. The metrics were impressive, but Harrison was more interested in the stories behind the numbers. "Tell me about Lieutenant Martinez's mission in Somalia," Harrison requested, referring to a case study that had become legendary within the military community. Lieutenant Maria Martinez, no relation to Maya's former crew chief, had been commanding a medical evacuation helicopter when she received a call to extract wounded peacekeepers from a compound surrounded by hostile forces. Standard procedures would have required the peacekeepers to fight their way to a secure landing zone, but Martinez had used Maya's framework to develop an alternative approach. Martinez recognized that conventional extraction would result in additional casualties among the wounded. She analyzed the situation, identified the real requirements versus the procedural requirements, and developed a solution that brought everyone home safely. Martinez had used her helicopter's winch system to extract personnel directly from the compound, hovering over the building while her crew pulled wounded soldiers up one at a time. It was a technique that required exceptional flying skills and precise coordination, but it eliminated the need for the wounded to move through hostile territory. The mission succeeded because Martinez had been trained to think beyond standard procedures while maintaining the discipline and coordination necessary for effective operations.
Maya continued. She didn't ignore orders. She fulfilled the intent of her orders, using methods that her training had prepared her to consider. Harrison nodded approvingly. And what about resistance from traditional commanders? Are they accepting these new approaches? Maya smiled, remembering her own struggles with commanders who preferred predictable procedures to innovative solutions. There's still resistance, but it's decreasing as results speak for themselves. Commanders want successful missions and minimal casualties. When they see that innovative approaches can deliver both, they become advocates. The transformation had not been without challenges. Some officers struggled to balance creativity with discipline, occasionally making decisions that were genuinely reckless rather than innovatively bold. Others became paralyzed by the additional responsibility that came with expanded decision-making authority. Maya had learned to identify and address both tendencies through refined training methods and improved mentorship programs. The goal was to develop officers who could distinguish between calculated risks and unnecessary dangers, who understood when innovation was appropriate and when adherence to established procedures was essential. The key is helping officers develop what we call contextual judgment, Maya explained. They need to understand not just what the rules are, but why the rules exist and when the underlying purposes might be better served by alternative approaches. As Maya concluded her presentation, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a court-martial to a position of influence within the military establishment. Her willingness to risk everything to save 23 SEALs had cost her one career, but had ultimately led to a different kind of service, one that might save many more lives by changing how the military approached impossible situations. The program's success had attracted international attention, with military organizations from allied nations requesting training and consultation. Maya found herself traveling to countries around the world, sharing her insights with officers who faced their own challenges balancing innovation with discipline. But the most meaningful aspect of her work remained the individual stories.
officers who had used her training to save lives, to achieve mission success under impossible circumstances, and to uphold the military's fundamental commitment to bringing everyone home. During a recent visit to Afghanistan, Maya had met with the crew of a helicopter that had successfully extracted a patrol from an ambush using techniques derived from her framework. The pilot, Captain Jennifer Walsh, the same lawyer who had defended Maya during her court-martial but who had since transferred to flight operations, described how the training had given her confidence to attempt a rescue that conventional doctrine would have declared impossible. Your program didn't just teach us new techniques, it taught us to trust our judgment and to take responsibility for doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Maya had looked at the young pilot and seen something of her own younger self, someone who understood that the military's mission extended beyond following orders to encompassing the moral obligation to bring everyone home. The difference was that Walsh and her generation had institutional support for innovative thinking that Maya had been forced to develop on her own. As Maya's presentation concluded and the panel began discussing implementation plans for expanding the program, she thought about the phone call she would make that evening to Morrison and the other SEALs whose lives had been saved by her decision to exceed her authority 5 years earlier. They had remained in contact throughout her journey from court-martial to institutional advocate, providing encouragement during difficult periods and celebrating her successes. More importantly, they had served as constant reminders of why the work mattered, why it was worth challenging established thinking to ensure that no one was left behind.
The program is working, Maya would tell them. Officers across the military are learning to think differently about impossible situations. Your rescue wasn't just about saving 23 lives that night. It was about changing how we approach every rescue that comes after. The legacy of that impossible night in Afghanistan had grown far beyond what Maya could have imagined when she made the split-second decision to bring everyone home. Her choice had rippled through military institutions, training programs, and operational procedures, creating a new understanding of leadership that valued both innovation and discipline. Most importantly, it had established the principle that there was always another way, always another solution, if someone was willing to look hard enough and sacrifice everything to find it. 10 years later, the helicopter touched down on the landing pad of the new Crisis Leadership Institute in Colorado Springs, and Maya Chen stepped out onto the tarmac with the easy confidence of someone who had spent her life around aircraft. At 42, she carried herself with the bearing of a veteran who had seen combat and come through it with her principles intact. Her hair was shorter now, touched with gray at the temples, and she wore the simple blue uniform of the Institute's senior staff. The Institute had grown from a small research organization into an internationally recognized center for crisis management and emergency response training. The sprawling campus included simulation facilities, research laboratories, and living quarters for students who came from around the world to study the principles that Maya had pioneered during her military service. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, now in her 70s, but still serving as the Institute's director emeritus, met Maya at the landing pad. How did the consultation in Nepal go? Better than expected, Maya replied as they walked toward the main building. The Nepal earthquake response teams there are implementing modified versions of our framework, and initial results are promising. They managed to extract survivors from 3 collapsed buildings that conventional methods couldn't reach. The Nepal consultation was part of Maya's expanding international work. The Institute now provided training and support to emergency response organizations in over 30 countries, adapting the principles of crisis decision-making to different cultures, equipment, and operational environments. Maya's office overlooked the campus's central courtyard, where students from military, emergency response, and civilian organizations
trained together on complex scenarios that required innovative thinking and collaborative problem-solving. Through her window, she could see a group of firefighters from Japan working with Navy helicopter pilots and disaster relief specialists from Germany, all focused on a simulation involving a chemical plant explosion that required unconventional evacuation methods. The diversity of the student body reflected how broadly Maya's principles had been adopted. The techniques she had developed for military medical evacuation had proven applicable to civilian emergency response, corporate crisis management, and even space exploration. NASA regularly sent personnel to the Institute for training on decision-making under extreme conditions. Maya's assistant, Captain Sarah Kim, the former Los Angeles Fire Department specialist who had attended one of Maya's early training sessions, knocked on the door and entered with a tablet showing the day's schedule. Kim had joined the Institute after retiring from active firefighting, bringing with her extensive experience in urban disaster response. Your 10 o'clock interview with 60 Minutes is confirmed. They want to do a 10-year retrospective on the Afghanistan extraction and how it changed military and emergency response training. Maya nodded, though she felt the familiar ambivalence about media attention that had never entirely disappeared. The story of her decision to save 23 SEALs had been told countless times in newspapers, magazines, documentaries, and even a Hollywood movie that had taken considerable liberties with the facts. While the attention had helped spread awareness of her training methods, it had also simplified a complex story into a narrative about heroic individuals defying authority.
What about the afternoon briefing with the Joint Chiefs? Confirmed for 2 o'clock, General Williams will be attending virtually from the Pentagon, and they want a comprehensive update on how the military's adoption of your framework has affected operational effectiveness over the past decade. The briefing would mark another milestone in Maya's unlikely journey from court-martialed pilot to influential policy advisor. The Joint Chiefs of Staff now received annual reports on the implementation of crisis leadership training across all service branches, and Maya's recommendations had influenced everything from equipment procurement to personnel selection criteria. Before the interviews, Maya walked through the Institute's Hall of Recognition, a long corridor lined with photographs and brief stories of individuals who had applied her training principles in real-world crisis situations. The collection had grown to include hundreds of cases from around the world: rescue workers who had saved lives using unconventional methods, military personnel who had succeeded in impossible missions, and civilian emergency responders who had found innovative solutions to unprecedented challenges. One of the newest additions to the hall was the story of Commander Jessica Torres, the Navy pilot who had attended one of Maya's early training sessions as a lieutenant. Torres had recently led a rescue operation that extracted an entire research team from an Antarctic station threatened by a catastrophic ice shelf collapse. The mission had required flying in weather conditions that would normally ground all aircraft, using navigation techniques that were not covered in standard procedures. Torres used every principle we teach here, Maya told visitors during her regular tours of the facility. Situation analysis to understand why conventional rescue methods wouldn't work, outcome assessment to clarify what success looked like, resource evaluation to identify unconventional capabilities, and consequence acceptance to take personal responsibility for an unprecedented decision. Torres' mission had saved 17 researchers and demonstrated how Maya's framework could be applied in environments far removed from military combat. The principles of crisis leadership were proving to be universal, applicable wherever individuals faced complex decisions under pressure with incomplete information. Maya's work had also influenced how organizations thought about leadership development and institutional change. Business schools now taught case studies based on her decision-making framework, and corporate executives attended institute programs to learn how to encourage innovation while maintaining organizational discipline. The 60 Minutes interview took place in the Institute's main conference room, with the interviewer focusing on both the personal costs and the broader impact of Maya's decision to exceed her authority during the Afghanistan extraction. 10 years later, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had followed orders that night? The interviewer asked. Maya had been asked similar questions countless times, but she still considered her answer carefully. I know what would have happened. 23 American servicemen would have died in that compound, and their families would have received folded flags instead of homecoming hugs. That's not something I could have lived with. But your decision to disobey orders also cost you your military career and led to years of controversy about military discipline. That's true, but it also led to changes in how we train military personnel and emergency responders to think about impossible situations. Sometimes individual sacrifice creates opportunities for institutional improvement. The interviewer pressed on the broader implications of Maya's story. Critics argue that your case has encouraged insubordination and undermined military discipline. How do you respond to that? Maya smiled, having heard this criticism many times over the years. The data doesn't support that argument. Military units that have implemented crisis leadership training show improved discipline, not decreased discipline. When people understand why rules exist and when they might need to be modified, they make better decisions about when to follow them and when to challenge them.
The statistics supported Maya's position. Military commands that had adopted her training methods showed lower rates of disciplinary problems alongside improved mission success rates. Officers who understood the principles of contextual decision-making were less likely to make arbitrary or rebellious choices, not more likely. After the interview, Maya drove to Peterson Air Force Base for her briefing with the Joint Chiefs. The presentation took place in a secure conference room, with screens showing participants from military commands around the world. General Williams, now serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, presided over the meeting from the Pentagon. Colonel Chen, Williams began, using Maya's current reserve rank. Your 10-year report shows remarkable improvements in operational effectiveness across all service branches. Can you highlight the most significant developments? Maya had been promoted to colonel in the Air Force Reserve 2 years earlier, recognition of her contributions to military training and operational effectiveness. The promotion had been controversial among some traditionalists, but it had been supported by commanders who had seen the practical benefits of her methods. The most significant development is the cultural shift we've seen in how officers approach complex problems, Maya replied. 10 years ago, faced with an impossible situation, most officers would focus on why something couldn't be done. Today, they're more likely to focus on how it might be done differently. Maya presented data showing that military units using her training framework had achieved a 23% improvement in mission success rates and a 31% reduction in casualties during high-risk operations. Perhaps more importantly, post-mission analysis showed that officers were making more thoughtful decisions under pressure, balancing innovation with appropriate risk management. We're also seeing improved retention rates among junior officers, Maya continued. When people feel empowered to think creatively and take appropriate initiative, they're more likely to stay in military service and develop into effective leaders. The briefing included case studies from recent operations where military personnel had applied Maya's principles to achieve successful outcomes in challenging situations. A Marine unit in the Pacific had used unconventional tactics to evacuate civilians from a volcanic eruption. An Army aviation unit had developed innovative approaches to resupply operations in mountainous terrain. A Navy destroyer had rescued merchant sailors from a sinking vessel using methods that required real-time adaptation of standard procedures. General Williams asked about international collaboration and how other militaries were implementing similar training programs. Colonel Chen, what can you tell us about foreign adoption of these methods? We've provided training to military organizations from 27 allied nations. Each country has adapted the basic principles to their own culture and operational requirements, but the fundamental concepts translate well across different military traditions.
Maya described recent collaboration with the British Royal Navy, which had integrated crisis leadership training into their officer development programs. She also discussed work with Canadian forces on Arctic rescue operations and partnerships with Australian emergency response teams on disaster relief procedures. The international adoption of Maya's methods had created a network of military and civilian organizations that shared knowledge and best practices for crisis management. Annual conferences brought together practitioners from around the world to discuss new developments and emerging challenges. After the briefing, Maya was approached by General Williams for a private conversation. "Maya, I want to discuss a new opportunity that's being considered at the highest levels of government." Williams explained that the White House was establishing a new position, National Director of Crisis Leadership, that would coordinate emergency response capabilities across all federal agencies. The role would involve working with military commands, civilian emergency services, intelligence agencies, and international partners to improve the nation's ability to respond to complex crises.
The president wants someone who understands both the technical aspects of crisis management and the leadership challenges involved in coordinating multiple agencies with different cultures and priorities, Williams said. "Your name is at the top of the list." Maya was intrigued by the opportunity, but also concerned about the political dimensions of a White House appointment. Her work at the Institute had been deliberately nonpartisan, focused on developing practical solutions rather than advancing political agendas. "General, what would be the scope of authority for this position?" "Broad enough to make real changes, but limited enough to avoid stepping on existing agency territories. Think of it as institutionalizing at the national level what you've accomplished in military training, creating frameworks for innovation while maintaining necessary coordination and discipline." Maya requested time to consider the offer, wanting to discuss it with her mentors and colleagues before making a decision that would again change the direction of her career. 15 years later, Maya Chen stood at the podium in the United Nations General Assembly, addressing delegates from 193 countries on the global adoption of crisis leadership principles. At 47, she served as the director of the UN Office for Crisis Innovation, a position created 5 years earlier to help member nations develop improved capabilities for responding to complex emergencies. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenges we face today, from climate change to cyber attacks to pandemic diseases, require responses that transcend traditional boundaries between military and civilian agencies, between national and international organizations, between government and private sector capabilities. The UN position represented the latest evolution of Maya's work, extending the principles she had developed for military medical evacuation to global humanitarian response. Her office coordinated training programs, shared best practices, and provided technical assistance to countries facing unprecedented crisis situations. The speech marked the release of a comprehensive study showing that countries using crisis leadership training methods had achieved significantly better outcomes during recent emergencies. When Hurricane Maria had devastated Puerto Rico, emergency response teams trained in Maya's methods had evacuated 15,000 people using improvised techniques when conventional approaches failed. During the Australian wildfires, firefighting teams had saved entire communities by adapting military extraction principles to civilian evacuation operations. Maya's personal story had become inseparable from the broader movement she had helped create. The 23 SEALs she had rescued 15 years earlier had gone on to leadership positions throughout the military and veteran communities, carrying forward the lessons they had learned about the importance of bringing everyone home. Commander Morrison, now Admiral Morrison, and serving as Chief of Naval Operations, had been instrumental in establishing the Morrison Chen Veterans Foundation, which provided crisis leadership training to veteran organizations and supported research into improved emergency response capabilities. "Chen taught us that there's always another way," Morrison said during a recent foundation dinner.
That lesson didn't end when we left that compound in Afghanistan. It's something we carry with us every day, in every decision we make about how to serve others. The Foundation had trained thousands of veterans to apply crisis leadership principles in civilian careers, creating a network of first responders, business leaders, and community organizers who understood the importance of innovative thinking under pressure. Maya's influence had also extended into unexpected areas. Technology companies were using her decision-making framework to improve their software development processes. Medical schools were teaching her principles to help doctors make better decisions during emergency situations. Even space agencies were applying her methods to mission planning for Mars exploration, where the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances could determine mission success or failure. But Maya remained most proud of the individual stories. The rescue workers, military personnel, and ordinary citizens who had used her training to save lives and achieve outcomes that seemed impossible using conventional approaches.
During her recent visit to Japan, Maya had met with earthquake response teams who had successfully extracted survivors from collapsed buildings using techniques derived from her military experience. The teams had modified helicopter extraction methods for urban disaster response, developing new capabilities that had saved dozens of lives during recent seismic events. "Your training helped us see possibilities that we had never considered," explained Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, the lead coordinator for Japan's National Earthquake Response Program. "We learned to think beyond our standard procedures and find solutions that match the specific requirements of each situation." Maya's work had also influenced how organizations thought about leadership development and cultural change. The principles of crisis leadership were being applied to corporate restructuring, educational reform, and community development projects around the world. 20 years later, the retirement ceremony took place at the Air Force Academy, the same institution where Maya had spoken to cadets about leadership and moral courage decades earlier. Now 52 and retiring from her position as director of the UN Office for Crisis Innovation, Maya stood before an audience that included military leaders, emergency response professionals, and civilians whose lives had been touched by her work. General Williams, now retired herself but serving as president of the Crisis Leadership Institute, delivered the keynote address. 20 years ago, Staff Sergeant Maya Chen made a decision that changed not just 23 lives, but the way we think about leadership, innovation, and the responsibility to bring everyone home. Williams traced the evolution of Maya's influence from a single helicopter extraction to a global movement that had changed how organizations approached complex challenges. Maya's legacy isn't just in the lives she saved that night in Afghanistan, but in the thousands of lives that have been saved since by people who learned to think differently about impossible situations. The ceremony included presentations from representatives of organizations around the world that had implemented crisis leadership training. A firefighter from Brazil described how the methods had helped her team rescue workers from a collapsed mine. A Coast Guard commander from Norway explained how the principles had improved maritime rescue operations in the Arctic. A disaster relief coordinator from the Philippines shared stories of successful evacuations during typhoon emergencies. Maya's retirement speech focused not on her own accomplishments, but on the future challenges that would require continued innovation and adaptation. The principles we've developed over the past 20 years, situation analysis, outcome assessment, resource evaluation, and consequence acceptance, are tools, not solutions. Each generation will face new challenges that require creative thinking and moral courage. She spoke about emerging threats that would test the next generation of crisis leaders, cyber attacks that could cripple critical infrastructure, climate change that would create unprecedented displacement of populations, and technological advances that would create new vulnerabilities alongside new capabilities. The young people in this audience will face situations that we cannot imagine today, just as I faced a situation 20 years ago that wasn't covered in any manual or training program. What matters is not having all the answers, but having the tools and the courage to find new answers when the old ones aren't sufficient. Maya concluded her speech with the same message she'd been sharing for 20 years. There is always another way,
always another solution if someone is willing to look hard enough and sacrifice everything to find it. That's not just a military principle or an emergency response technique. It's a way of approaching life that can make the impossible possible. 25 years later. Maya Chen sat in her study in the house she had built near the Crisis Leadership Institute, writing the final chapter of her memoir. At 57, she had been retired from active service
For 5 years, but her influence continued to grow through the thousands of people who had been trained in her methods and who were now training others. The walls of her study were covered with photographs that told the story of a quarter-century of crisis leadership development. There were pictures of the original 23 SEALs she had rescued, many of them now serving in senior leadership positions. There were photographs of rescue workers from around the world who had used her training to save lives. There were images of students who had attended the institute and gone on to careers in emergency response, military service, and crisis management. But the photograph that held the place of honor on her desk was a simple image taken by Martinez during the helicopter extraction 25 years earlier. It showed Maya at the controls of the damaged Chinook, her face focused and determined as she maneuvered the aircraft through the impossible landing in the Afghan compound. Maya's memoir, titled "There's Always Another Way," would be published the following year and would become required reading at military academies and emergency response training centers around the world. But more than a personal story, it was a guide to the principles of crisis leadership that had evolved from her single decision to exceed her authority and bring everyone home. The book's final chapter would end with the same message that had guided Maya's work for 25 years. Leadership in crisis isn't about having perfect information or following predetermined procedures. It's about understanding what really matters, being willing to think differently about what's possible, and accepting responsibility for the consequences of your decisions. Whether you're flying a helicopter into a combat zone, responding to a natural disaster, or simply trying to solve a problem that nobody has solved before, the principles remain the same. Analyze the situation honestly. Focus on the outcomes that matter. Use every resource available, and have the courage to accept responsibility for unprecedented decisions. 25 years ago, I faced an impossible choice between following orders and bringing 23 people home. I chose to bring them home, and that choice changed my life and the lives of countless others. Not because my decision was perfect, but because it demonstrated that there is always another way if someone is willing to find it. The next generation of crisis leaders will face challenges that we cannot imagine today. They will need to develop new methods, new technologies, and new approaches to problems that don't yet exist. But the fundamental principles will remain the same: courage, creativity, and an unshakable commitment to bringing everyone home. There is always another way, always another solution, always another possibility. The only question is whether someone will have the courage to find it. Maya set down her pen and looked out the window at the Crisis Leadership Institute campus, where the next generation of rescue workers, military personnel, and emergency responders were learning to think differently about impossible situations. In a few hours, she would give a guest lecture to a group of students from around the world, sharing the lessons she had learned during a career that had started with a single decision to exceed her authority and bring everyone home. The students would ask questions about decision-making under pressure, about balancing innovation with discipline, and about finding the courage to challenge established limitations. Maya would answer them as she always did, by sharing stories of real people who had faced impossible situations and found ways to make them possible. But mostly, she would remind them that the principles they were learning were not abstract concepts, but practical tools for saving lives and achieving outcomes that mattered. Whether they became military pilots, firefighters, paramedics, or corporate leaders, they would face moments when conventional approaches were insufficient, and they would need to find another way. Maya's legacy was not just in the lives she had saved that night in Afghanistan, but in the understanding she had helped create that there was always another way, always another solution if someone was willing to look hard enough and sacrifice everything to find it.
As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, Maya thought about the 23 SEALs who had started it all, most of them now retired from military service, but still carrying forward the lessons they had learned about bringing everyone home. They had remained in contact over the years, gathering annually to remember the night that had changed all their lives and to celebrate the ripple effects that continued to spread around the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to share the principles that had emerged from a single impossible decision 25 years earlier. Maya looked forward to it all, knowing that the work of bringing everyone home was never truly finished, only passed on to the next generation of leaders who would find their own ways to make the impossible possible. Subscribe to She Stood First, where silence is never forgotten.